In today's Photoshop lesson, I'd like to show you a quick and powerful tool to adjust the shadows and highlights in your photos using Photoshop's Shadows and Highlights dialog box. This dialog box has 8 sliders which will give you control over the brightness of the shadows and highlights. It also allows you to choose what brightness will be a shadow or a highlight. It can add texture and color to shadows and highlights as well. Let's get started. So here we are in Photoshop, and this image is nice on the screen, but it just prints too dark. So let's use shadows and highlights to lighten up this image. So we do that by going up here to Image, Adjustments, Shadows and Highlights. Okay, that brings up this dialog box. It says Shadows and Highlights. Now there's 2 settings here. One where Show More Options is off, and then you just get Shadows and Highlights. You can see that it defaults to 35% on the shadows and 0 on the highlights. So we're not darkening the highlights at all, and Photoshop to add 35% to the shadows. You can move the sliders to make it lighter to the right, move the sliders to the left to make it darker, and if you like the way it looks, you're done. If you want to add a little highlights, you just add what you do is you darken the highlights by moving this to the right. So this is one of the brighter parts. You can see how it looks, and then the preview button's right here. We can get a before and after, so you can see that makes a big difference. But there are more adjustments, so we'll show more. Now to the shadows we have tone and radius. Same thing on highlights, tone and radius, and we have a whole new section down here called color and midtone. Let's go through these one at a time, starting at the top. Shadows. Okay, the amount of the shadows that will be lightened is controlled by this slider. If we push it all the way to the left, not so much. It won't make it very bright. The shadow's bright. The tone picks out what brightness will be adjusted. In other words, if the tone is to the left, only the very dark tones in the image will be adjusted. As you move the tone to the right, it gets a little brighter, and what's happening is the lighter darks, and if you know what I mean, are being adjusted, whereas over here only the darkest darks were adjusted. Okay, and the radius is, think of that as a contrast adjustment, kind of like clarity. Let me bump some radius. You can see it changes the image.
As you move the radius to the right, it adds a little texture, almost like clarity, to your photo. Okay, then we got the highlights. Well, same thing on the highlights. The amount's on 33. That means it's going to darken the highlights by this amount. Now the tone again refers to what is a highlight. In other words, only the brighter parts. If you move it down here, only the brighter parts are the highlights, but as you move it to the right, the less bright highlights will become darker, if that makes sense. And then we got the radius, same thing. That's going to add some contrast, texture to the light areas. Okay, let me show you what adjustments do. Adjustments, there's color. Now what happens when you make these adjustments, these bright to shadows and highlights, the color kind of goes flat. So Photoshop adds a 20 plus 20 color. Now if I increase that, you can see the image gets more colorful, and if you decrease it, it gets less colorful. Okay, midtones is like a mid-tone contrast. It kind of can flatten out by adding some midtones. You'll see it adds a little contrast to the midtone area. Now the black clip and white clip determine how black the blacks are and how much is black, how much is white. Let me give you an example. This is on 0.01, and I find that's a good place for it. But if we change it to a number like 2, you can see all those whites that were close to bright have become solid white. They become really bright. So I find it's probably better to leave those just where they were. Now let me return this back to the normal setting. If I hold the Alt or Option on a Mac, you see this reset button right here? I'll just click on that and everything goes back the way Photoshop put it in to start with, which was some shadows 35, tone at 50, highlights nothing, there's a 0 here, and then adjustments plus 20 on the color, and the black clip is set to these low numbers. Okay, so now if we really want to adjust this, we'll just look it over. I think that it's a little bit too much, maybe we don't need that much. Let me move the tone down. So I'm saying, hey, just brighten up the darkest part. Don't go crazy in these midtones so much. Okay, and the highlights, well, let's add a little highlights. We'll dim the highlights a little bit. I'm looking at that Dry Creek sign, see if it gets any darker. I'm going to knock the tones down a little bit. Maybe a little bit more. Let's see. Okay. Okay, so we made some adjustments. You adjust these any way you like. I'm going to leave adjustments, the color and tone the way it is. Let's take a preview. Well, that made a big difference. That should print a lot different, huh? Okay. Now, if we like this, we can actually save it. Let me show you. If I click Save, and I've already saved this, it's called Light and Shadows. I'll click on Save. It says it already exists. You want to replace it? Yeah, let's replace it. Okay, so now that's been saved. All these settings been saved. We can say OK, and it's done. On the next image, let's take this image. Now on this image, it's kind of the same way. It's too dark. It's going to print too dark. So let's make the same adjustments. Now what we should do probably, and I didn't tell you the first time, is maybe copy this layer. So let's just do a Control or Command J. We copy the layer, and if you right click on the layer, you can go down here and convert to a smart object. Now we can make, once we make these adjustments, we can readjust them and it won't be destructive in any way. Okay, now what we want to do, let's take these transforms off. Okay, now we're going to use shadows and highlights like we did before. So we'll go Image, Adjustments, Shadows and Highlights, and it comes up with the same settings as it always does, 35, and everything else is kind of zeroed out. But let's load our last one because this is kind of bright. So we'll go to Load. Remember Light and Shadows? If I double click, it automatically loaded the same settings as we had ourselves. So at 35, lowered the tone, radius, added a little of that. If you like it, you're done. If you want to say maybe it's a little too bright, I'll lower the shadows a little bit. Whatever you want to do, you can adjust it there and say OK. So that image is done. And let's go to the last one. On this image, I just found the sky didn't print too well. It's a little bit washed out. So I really want to lower the highlights on this image. So let's do the same thing. This time I'm just going to drag this layer to the new layer icon. That makes a copy. I'm going to right click. I'm going to click on Convert to Smart Object, and now we have a copy. Okay. Same thing as before. We're going to go to Image, Adjustments, Shadows and Highlights. Okay, and now Photoshop made the same default adjustments. Now what we want to do here is, the shadows I think are not so bad. Let's move those down for now. And let's go to the highlights, and let's see if we can darken those highlights a little bit. So I'm going to move this slider up maybe about this much. See what it does to the highlights. It did okay. It got the sky darker, but it also got this building. So let's move the tone down so it just affects this lighter part. Maybe a little bit more. Okay. So I'm trying to darken the sky. Let's see if we've done any good. If I click on Preview, yeah, some of the sky got darker. So that's not too bad. Maybe increase a little more. I'll show you a way to fix this. Okay, yeah, let's go with that sky. And while we're at it, this truck got a little dark. Let's increase the shadows just a tad. Okay, and just the darker area. So I'm going to move the tone down Let's check the preview button. Yep, around the car got brighter, the sky got darker, and let's see what the building does. Building stayed about the same, which I didn't mind the building the way it was. Anyway, we're going to say OK to this. Now that should print better. But we do have a mask here. So let me just show you. If you didn't like something the way it did it, like let's say the building might have been just got affected. If I click on the mask and I didn't want the building affected, I can click on the mask, got a little box around it. See the little box? So that's what's highlighted right now. And let's get a brush. I'm going to tap the letter B. It brings up the brush. I want a black one. It's black. I'm looking at the foreground color here. It's black. And it's a little big. Left bracket key. Now if I brush over this, it will bring the building back to where it was. You can see on the mask. So that's before, and this is the afters. So, and if I think this driveway, I want to darken this driveway, I can actually mask that out. But let's just do that at 50%. I'm going to tap the 5 key, lower the opacity to 50%. Click on the mask again. Make it a little bigger this time, and I'm just going to brush across this driveway and darken that driveway just a little bit. Okay? And there we have it, before and after. Okay, and our sky's a little darker, and that should work better. Okay, for a quick review, I'm going to double click right here where it says shadows and highlights. I'll double click. Up pops the shadows and highlights dialog box. Let me move it up to the top. Again, shadows will be lightened, the amount, which brightnesses, and how much texture you want to add, or clarity is the radius. Highlights will be darkened. How much you want them darker, what brightness of the highlight you want affected, and then the radius adds that little bit of texture. Color, you can add color to the photo because sometimes that takes it away. Midtones adds a little mid-tone contrast. And then the clip, I think you're going to find you want to leave them right there. So we'll cancel this. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something.